which is an opportunity to hear from Jim Beever, and is the persistence of vision. That's a typo. Protecting the quilt of the habitats drawn together by the threads of water. So it's to highlight the successes in conserving land in the CHNEP area through land acquisitions and conservation land stewardship. Again, this relates to fish, wildlife, and habitat protection priority action number 2. Protect, restore, and monitor environmentally sensitive lands and waterways, including critical habitat areas. So Jim, you're on. Thank you.
You're welcome, and please confirm that you can hear me. Okay, thank you.
Sure can.
This presentation that I'm showing you today came from 2 sources. Back in 2012, I put together the original Persistence of Vision presentation to highlight the success of the CHNEP toward achieving what was then their FW1 goal of having at least 100% increase in conservation lands within what was then the boundaries of the Charlotte Harbor National Estuary Program. But I also want to talk about what was important towards having successful land acquisition based on my 5-decade experience in doing it in Southwest Florida. And I use the term persistence of vision in a different sense than the way that people who study the visions of human beings do. I'm talking about how you have to stay on your vision for a long time if you want to protect the quilt of habitats that are drawn together by the threads of water that make up Southwest Florida. I emphasize that it's a quilt because unfortunately, too often when people are talking about land acquisition, they concentrate on one habitat type. And they always try to claim that that habitat type is more important than every other habitat type. So that's why you have to protect that one. And this creates fragmented landscapes of conservation, when in fact we need to protect all the habitats together, and they are connected in South Florida by water, and that is the threads that hold it together. Next slide, please. So the Coastal Heartland National Estuary Program, you know the boundaries. The one that I grew up with, the one I helped establish back at the beginning, did not include the upper Caloosahatchee River Basin above the S79 canal. But now it does, and you'll see some of my numbers involved when it was the old boundaries, some of them involved the current boundaries. The other reason I did this presentation is I was requested by a professor at FGCU to give her students some inspiration towards getting involved in the land conservation career, and to help them explain to them what would really be involved with that. Next slide, please. So there's been great success in land acquisition and conservation land stewardship within the CHNEP. Between 1998, when we first started keeping counts on it, and 2012, when I first did this presentation, there had been a 91% increase in the land conservation in the watershed. A lot of that had to do with partnerships, everyone working together with goals, including the NEP helping coordinate some of that activity. What you see here is the base that it existed in 2012 is in orange, and the additions cumulatively are in green. You can see there are periods when we get a big jump, periods when things remain relatively stable, and then we jump again. And this reflects the non-periodic process of land conservation. You get watershed years when everything comes together. You get years when you get a political administration that wants nothing to do with land acquisition. And your partners change too. In some years, you have more activity coming from the state. In some years, you get more activity coming from the local governments. Next slide, please. So since that time, we've ended up with a 213% increase in conservation lands from 1998 to 2022, which is the last year that I was able to obtain the information. I really want to thank Nicole for providing all the data that I needed in order to do this assessment couldn't have done this without that information. So the success has more than achieved the original FW1 goal of the CHNEP. And again, you see this periods of slow progress, gradual progress, and then a big jump when we acquire properties like the Babcock Ranch Preserve, and then things slowing down and almost nothing happening if it hadn't been for the local governments and some local conservation organizations like the Conservation Foundation or the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation or some of the land trusts being active while federal and state governments reneged on their commitment to conservation for during certain administrations. Next slide, please. So that success overall from 1930, I got data all the way back to then when we didn't have any. It really began with the New Deal, with some of our land conservation and some individual legislators in the state who had particular lands that they liked a lot and liked to hunt quail on. And they would get special, legislation put in, and we got some of our first big preserves like the Cecil Webb Wildlife Management Area, and individual activists like Ding Darling pushing for the National Wildlife Refuge on Sanibel. So that's how we got that increase from 30 to the 1980s. And then since then, there's been more concerted efforts. And you can see each of these data points reflect periods when I was able to accumulate enough information. And then it really picked up in the middle 80s with our coordinated efforts among all the agencies, the citizens. Next slide, please. So no major conservation effort in Southwest Florida has succeeded without citizen support. And the role of government is in service to that support. These get initiated by citizens, by people working together. And of course, I include myself as a citizen in this. Most of my work in land conservation was in identifying properties that could be conserved, that were worthy of conservation, surveying them, putting together the proposal, and finding a venue that there'd be an entity that would provide support for that land acquisition, whether it be a citizen group, a conservation organization like Nature Conservancy or Trust for Public Lands, a local government, every partner that I could find that would be interested in conserving that land. And in the end, it is the citizens and the community that make or break a conservation acquisition project. And in fact, I've had experiences where we were moving along with great success and we we're about to get a parcel of land set aside, and then just one citizen stopped it because of something that they had to do or had to say for themselves that convinced the property owner they did not want to sell. And this is something to consider, that you work together to this in partnerships, but sometimes if one of your partners wants to derail it, it will become derailed. And oftentimes you'll hear people lauding people or organizations for their success in conservation lands. And I will sit still and be quiet because I know what really happened in the lands we lost. The properties that we could have had, the places that would have been preserved if one thing hadn't happened. If somebody didn't say, well, we can't purchase that because we don't have the management monies for that. Or I don't want this acquired with an easement unless I have total access to the property, rather than allowing the property owner to have some limited access around their residence. So those sort of things happen, but it's the citizens of the community that make, and I want to emphasize, or break a conservation acquisition project. Next slide, please. So in the early 1960s, concerned citizens in Lee County began a movement to save Estero Bay from development. In 1966, these citizens, members of the Lee County Conservation Association and the Southwest Florida Conservation Clearinghouse, two organizations you probably hadn't heard about, but were the active environmental groups at that time, succeeded in convincing the trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund of the state of Florida, which are basically the property owners of state lands, to pass the first aquatic preserve law in the United States. The law served as a basis for aquatic preserve laws throughout the country. And what's interesting is this partnership was of all kinds of citizens down here and had the support of the landowners, of professionals, of retirees, of people who were long-term residents of Fort Myers Beach, Bonita Beach, but also the mainland areas, people from Sanibel, commercial fishermen working with recreational fishermen not attacking commercial fishermen, all together wanting to get Estero Bay preserved. So it was a time that everybody said, let's keep this safe. And it was done by the citizens. This didn't come from a government. And that's the very first aquatic preserve. And that's why you have that in your CHNEP. And of course, you've had many aquatic preserves designated since then, typically through citizen action, wanting it, and then us acting as the stewards for them to help get it done. Next slide, please. So I've been interested in conserving land since I was little, or young at least. I wasn't little at that time. And it was known as I was graduating from North Fort Myers High School, I wanted to become a conservation biologist. And it took note, and because I was a merit scholar, the newspapers ran some articles about me and how I wanted to become an ecologist, and I would have to piece my majors together to do that because there weren't ecology degrees at the time that I graduated from high school. And you can see I was very stylish in the clothing of that time. Next slide, please. So we knew that there were plans to develop the north shore of Estero Bay with a community that would look pretty much like Cape Coral. They were going to finger canal it. They're going to build a thing called an interceptor waterway, which was a big canal, which is very similar to the interceptor waterways that Cape Coral has on its western boundary. And all that was supposed to be okay. Well, we knew it wasn't going to be okay, and a lot of other citizens knew that. And the organizations that had worked to get Estero Bay put into aquatic preserve wanted to stop this. And of course, the developer called it the estuaries, was what they were going to call the development. And so we got together ourselves, along with some scientists that would support us from the universities, and want to work against getting this approved. Unfortunately, it was approved by the state. It was approved by the federal government, and the last thing it needed was local government approval. And that's where we were able to put the brakes on it. Next slide, please. And this happened in a coalition. And the local county commissioners did not approve the estuaries. And that's why that land stayed as the estuaries and was available to stayed as an estuary and was able to then be preserved as part of the Estero Bay State Park buffer. So that we did when I should have mentioned, that happened when I was with the Mundy group the first time in 1972. And we took all the students, which were 2 students from each of the Lee County high schools, got together, formed a group called the Students for Environmental Action. We got other high school students together. We flooded the county commission chambers with students, activists, along with citizens and business people. And even the Chamber of Commerce didn't think it was a good idea at that time. And we were able to get the estuaries not approved by the Lee County Commission. And that's the only thing that stopped it. So then 1973, when I was in the second Monday group, I was a senior in high school at that time, we were studying the role of forested wetlands and became alarmed by how fast they were disappearing. We already knew the percentage losses. And we knew that there was a plan to turn 6 Mile Cypress Preserve into a canal just like the 10-mile canal and build development right up against that canal. So we thought there'd be a good place for people to instead have a park with cypress trees and where they could, have some public access to nature. So knowing it was under threat for logging and channeling, we launched a campaign to save it through a citizens initiative. Next slide, please. And so we worked out of the Gwynn Institute. We met every Monday there. At this was the first schoolhouse made of brick in Lee County, was the Gwynn Institute, and that was our meeting spot. And we went to work on getting it onto the ballot for the citizens of Lee County to vote to tax themselves to purchase the 6 Mile Cypress Preserve as public land that they could have access to. Next slide, please. And the campaign actually took 3 successive years, even from 72 to, or actually probably more than that. But took 3 years once we got the agreement that it could be put on the ballot. And it finally went onto the ballot in 1976. And the Lee County voters responded overwhelmingly, at least 80%, to increase their own taxes to vote, and in their vote, to purchase the 6 Mile Cypress Preserve. And this, to my knowledge, is the first time that local citizens in Southwest Florida decided to do a local land acquisition project. Now, I want to point out that the idea of preserving the preserve and the ongoing acquisition at the time, it took 35 years to purchase all of the pieces that were supposed to be purchased under that initiative, because it took a long time to get the individual property owners to decide to sell every piece of land that was needed to do the total preserve. And quite frankly, even then, we didn't get everything that we wanted, because when they built the parkway, the 6 Mile Cypress Parkway, they cut off one arm of the preserve that we would have liked to have had. Next slide, please. So another thing I worked on very early while I was still in high school with many others was the idea of panther wildlife crossings and fencing under Alligator Alley. It was known that a lot of panthers are being hit in Alligator Alley at specific places. There were areas that they preferentially crossed the road. So down at the bottom here, you can see the proposed land bridge for wildlife, is what they called it when it was first put together with an artist's rendition. That was back in the original environmental impact statement put together for turning Alligator Alley eventually into a 4-lane road of part of I-75. And I worked on this project as a high school student, as a college student, and later as a government state employee. I had the luck, or maybe the synergy of being the person that would have to that was involved with permitting whether the road could go in through Collier County. So along with many others, I was able to convince them that they needed to do the wildlife underpasses for the Florida panthers, and I helped put together the design for that. And so here you see the upper right, you can see the design as from the panthers' point of view when it was first finished. Now they have grass and other vegetation. You have to have the funnel fences to help the panthers get directed towards the underpass, but these were put in places studies had shown they were already crossing, both through their tracks and through their radio collard studies. And then you can see an aerial view of how the underpass looks completed from the air, and you can see that we left the area of the median open so there'd be airspace so the panthers didn't have to go through a long dark tunnel, and that's very important to them. Right, there are cameras installed in these, and that happened later. It wasn't a thing that the DOT wanted to see. They were complaining to me throughout the whole process, the state DOT, that this was a big waste of money. It cost too much. They claimed each underpass was $1 million a piece. They weren't, if you looked at the final cost, and that they'd never be used. And they threatened. They said, if you make us do these underpasses, if your agency, we will go out the media and claim that you wasted all these taxpayers' dollars, blame you by name. But we've still held ground. I said, no, you're going to have to do it. You got to save these panthers, and it's part of your mitigation. We did other mitigation requirements for them as well. The Florida Panther Preserve came out of that project too, that land being acquired. And so the cameras were put in. It proved that the panthers were using them, black bears were using them, alligators are using them, wading birds use them, all kinds of animals use them. And then one jerk in a gorilla suit was photographed by the infrared cameras holding up a sign, waste of taxpayers' money. Um, so they are getting used and they continue to be used, and the panther mortality went way down. Now, I want to point out that when in other places these underpasses have been built without the fencing, there is still panther mortality. And that's the problem. You've got to have the fencing as well as the underpasses for this to work. And the underpasses have to be high enough for the panthers not to feel that they're being too confined as they go underneath. So this has been a success, and others have been built. But from the time of the idea that we were going to do underpasses to the time that they actually were completed and successful took 23 years. The persistence of vision. Next slide, please. So the Florida Panther Preserve, the Big Cypress Addition, removal of road access along all of the original two-lane Alligator Alley, except at State Road 29. And at the Seminole Reservation, there's one road access, was all mitigation that we obtained in the four-laning of I-75. And so that's another way you get land we were able to get land acquisition, was through mitigative land acquisition associated not just with the footprint of the project, but with its secondary impacts and cumulative impacts that it could have. If we had left all of those things unused, those lands would have been developed. With road access along the entire interstate there, it would have done the very same thing you've seen what's happened to I-75 through Sarasota, Lee, and Collier counties down to the toll booth, where everything crowds up against the interstate, and it's interchange after interchange. And even now today, we still have more proposals for more interchanges on the interstate. So the really basic function of an interstate, which is fast travel between major places, goes away as it becomes just another large road within the urban metroplex. This prevented that from happening. And it also, quite frankly, ruined the dreams of many speculative real estate developers. Next slide, please. Here's some more views of how the undercross works, and just a couple of photos showing how the panthers use it at night and during the daytime. Next slide, please. So the idea of wildlife corridors is not new, even though some who want to promote it try to make it look like it's a brand new idea, like the Florida Wildlife Corridor Plan group. We first start working on them in the 1980s. We put wildlife corridors into several of the local comprehensive plans for local governments here in Southwest Florida. And this is just an example of how old it is. This is the map on the left is when we used CAD before ArcGIS existed. And then we were putting together pieces and showing how the fragmentation of the landscape could be interconnected with corridors both along the coast and interior. And that's something I want to emphasize. A lot of emphasis now on only doing the interior acquisition for the wide-ranging animals, but we still need to maintain those coastal corridors. And there's still opportunities for that, particularly as areas get cleared by natural processes that might be able to be acquired. So at the time that I did this report, I guess in 2012, we'd been working on these for over 26 years in wildlife corridors. Next slide, please. And of course, that work continues today. Here's a plan that we further put together once ArcGIS was available in 1990. And we worked together on the idea of how we could get a Florida black bear to be able to walk from Charlotte Harbor to Lake Okeechobee and down to the Big Cypress National Preserve. And a lot of the land acquisition efforts I put in were toward that goal, to get this large landscape scale conservation done not just for the black bear, but for everything else that it was an umbrella species for. And also because with sea level rise, habitats need to have room to migrate, and they will be able to if the corridors connect on this type of scale. In this map, the already acquired was in that light green. Things which needed to be added to it would be are shown here, the critical ones, not all of them, but the critical ones in red. And some of this you can see we were able to, like the Babcock Ranch, add to. This is even before we got the Babcock Ranch acquired. We were able to continue to work on that, and then the connections along Fish Eating Creek. And so a number of these have been since acquired. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we had to take this out. One, besides the business of identifying, surveying, getting it to a proposal, you want to go out and educate people and help people understand what you're doing so they will have a buy-in too. So this is one of many poster sessions that I took around the professional conferences nationally, in the state and locally. And a good example of the process that we undertook. And of course, you can see the partnership sign over here on the left. You've got the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission, the Nature Conservancy, and the CHNEP as partners at the time that I worked on that. Next slide, please. So one of the things we got worked on, I came up with along with my friend Kim Dryden. We worked on the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods acquisition. Now people like to call it the Yucca Pens. And I even get into disputes with people about why it's called the Yucca Pens. I've got my version, they've got their version, which involves gambling. My version involves the fact that they used to use the yucca plants as cattle pens. You plant them around, you make your enclosure, and then the cattle didn't want to prick themselves on the spines of the yucca, and that kept them. They weren't permanent cattle pens, but they were useful while you were doing your herding toward the coast to take to a shipping port. So first one out there, and that misty picture very early in the morning, one documented everything about them. And it was one of the last intact areas of hydric pine flatwood and cypress west of US 41 in Southwest Florida. And it was a flowway for waters coming out of the headwaters of this area towards Charlotte Harbor. And so it's obviously a place that needed protect, many listed species in it. And it took 22 years from the beginning to get it into this first major acquisitions. And of course, parts of it still need to be acquired today. And now the restoration plan, which I helped put together with others, is being undertaken by big partnerships towards getting the flowways working better and the land in its more natural state. Next slide, please. Myakka Prairies, Sarasota County ELAP, Longino Ranch were all parts of what we worked together with the county on and with many other partners, both private and public, and the citizens to create what we were calling the Myakka Island, a very big, large area that could be preserved, which could then serve as a core area for conservation, with making a connection along the Myakka River, both south and north. And these additions, along with all of the good things that have been done over the years, provide a core area. And quite frankly, there are more listed species there than people want to give credit for if you do the proper surveys for them. And so that was a 22-year process from building on the core of the original state park. Next slide, please. The Corkscrew Regional Ecosystem Watershed, or the CREW, was an idea that actually, I think, started with an environmental consultant working for private business. But many of the citizens in the area and others saw this as a partnership that could do both land conservation acquisition and guarantee public water supply, which was dependent increasingly upon drawing the water up from aquifers. And they needed to protect that core recharge area for those aquifers. And we put the project together, constructed it, many partners, and many different ways this land has been acquired. Everything from direct fee simple to mitigation trading in the Rural Land Stewardship Program of Collier County. Lee County lands were acquired much more rapidly. The Lee County Preservation 2020 has done a good job on that. But gradually, piece by piece, we are gotten crew acquired, and there's still more to do today. But there's also been restoration done recently. Restoration down in the Bonita Springs area took an area that could have become a subdivision and put it back into natural lands, and that's helped alleviate some of the flooding problems Bonita Springs has had. So really multifaceted project, a big success, great the management staff. And another thing the CHNEP helped with in its process. 22 years on that. Okay, that will be fine. You can switch to the next slide. The Babcock Ranch acquisition, 1990 to 2006. The idea that we could get Babcock Ranch as a connector between the Webb and Fish Eating Creek basically was developed to a certain extent. Going to have to be careful here because I worked on a lot, and people said it couldn't be done. A lot of people said it couldn't be done, including the agencies. This is one of the examples. Longino was another where I talked directly with the property and the ranch owners. And quite frankly, I think it helped. I worked for the Game and Fish Commission. They were more receptive to having a guy come up in the pickup truck with boots on and a cowboy hat than talking to somebody in a suit. And the person understood what they were doing and what they were doing that was good, and how they were keeping their land in a condition already that panther and bear and red-cockaded woodpeckers and wading birds liked. And it took a long time. For one reason, the owners wanted to sell all of their property, not just the ranch, but they wanted to sell land they owned in town, all to the state. And the funding sources for the type of acquisition that acquired conservation lands couldn't be used to purchase those other things. So then there was, penultimately, it came almost to a threat that it was going to be sold off in three pieces for three major development of regional impacts. But finally, there was able to reach an agreement where most of the land would be acquired as conservation land to become the preserve, and the parts that had already been impacted, and we mapped those out as to which ones were already in very bad shape, rock mines, converted pasture, watermelon fields, could be then turned into a much smaller development than the original plans that people had had. So it took 16 years. Next slide, please. And quite a bit of analysis. This shows how we were looking at it, or I was looking at it, in terms of making the connections between the Webb and Fish Eating Creek lands already in conservation. And the CHNEP helped me a lot with this. I think I would have not have had the opportunity to present to the governor and the cabinet if they hadn't stood by me and wanting to take this presentation further. Because at the time the Water Management District was supposed to be the lead agency. And quite frankly, they weren't making much progress. So this also showed below how it connected into the bigger picture of that corridor that went from Charlotte Harbor all the way over to Lake Okeechobee. Next slide, please. And this shows mapping of the wetlands and the upland matrix, and a really good example of that quilt that I was talking about, of how all the habitats fit together. And this actually makes a connection in a way between both Charlotte Harbor and the Caloosahatchee River through Telegraph Creek. Water on the Babcock goes both to the west and to the south. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to go outside the boundaries and talk about another one I worked on for decades, and that's the Southern Golden Gate Estates, now known as the Picayune Strand State Preserve. This was a very different one. In Babcock, it's one big landowner you're working with. In this one, it's literally thousands of landowners. Every little piece of Southern Golden Gate Estates, except for one part that was still owned by a Seminole tribe, was a 5 or a 15-acre ranchette, all sold by Gulf American Corporation. But it was very critical land for the Florida panther, for other listed species, and a hydrologic connection down to the Rookery Bay and 10,000 Islands. And over here we had Fakahatchee Strand. Over here, the Belle Meade area, which was also listed species habitat. Fakahatchee's on the right, Belle Meade's on the left. I realize you might not be able to see my pointer. And then this part with the white grid, those were the dirt roads, which were the only thing that had been done to the land before it was sold. And so this was worked on for 33 years. And pieces were being acquired first as mitigation for other projects at the north. But then the Conservancy of Southwest Florida got heavily involved, and they hired real estate agencies to start picking up property lot by lot by lot. We got it put onto a proposal as a Carl project. It got accepted because the adjacent property owners in the preserves, the Florida Panther Preserve, the Fakahatchee Strand wanted it. Many other conservation organizations wanted it. And it was eventually all acquired. And then it became the Picayune Strand State Forest. And they're doing a restoration to reflood. They blocked the canals that were draining it down into Fakahatchee Bay. And it's on towards a success. And one of the few of the Everglades restoration projects, which is coming closer to completion, that allow ones planned on the East Coast. Next slide, please. Here now I'm hopping to the north of your boundary area. Serenova and Starkey Ranch Preserves. This is mitigation for the construction of the Suncoast Parkway. When I reviewed that, I was able to convince the Florida Turnpike Authority that rather than run the parkway in a S shape through the middle of Serenova and with already approved development of regional impact, to instead run it along the boundary of it. The area that the road has been built is this golden line to the somewhat right of the picture. The area they wanted to run it through was the white line through the middle of the photo. And we got that set aside as the whole DRI was purchased out by the Florida Turnpike, and part of the Starkey Ranch talked with the ranchers there. They were willing to sell their wet parts, and we got the major parts of the two major rivers tributaries put in to preserve, and wildlife underpasses put on the turnpike for Florida black bear. That took about 12 years to do. Next slide, please. So other things you do that helps you with land acquisition is education programs and monitoring programs. And this is one I helped establish up in the Hillsborough River called the Frog Listening Network, and start back in 2001. And we were able to get most of the Hillsborough River Greenway, which you can see in the left slide, acquired by different agencies, different partners, all along the Hillsborough River and the Blackwater River, and got citizens and public and agencies involved in doing frog listening at spots throughout the Greenway to monitor the success and where the native species were, where the exotics were. And by, it's went on for 22 years by along, and it's still going on today. And other frog listening networks have formed up. And of course, FGCU has a program that Win Everham and David Burr, who's with the Regional Planning Council, helped get started. Next slide, please. So now I just want to talk a little bit about ecosystem services. One of the ways I've had success in convincing entities and governments to go for land acquisition is to look at the ecosystem services they provide without having to spend any money on them other than getting them preserved. So the ecosystem services come in many forms: provisioning, regulating, supporting, and even cultural. That boardwalk and 6 Mile Cypress Preserve, I regularly get nice notes from people saying how much they love that boardwalk and how much they love that the Monday group got it preserved and then walked through that swamp on the path of the boardwalk before the boardwalk was built. And now they've got that boardwalk they can go to get away from the urban part of Lee County. Next slide, please. So I did some evaluations for the CHNEP in 1986 dollars of the value of some of the lands, types of lands that they are protected. And so now in 2023 dollars, the mangrove forest provides a total ecosystem services value of, and by the way, these are actual services provided, not preference ecosystem services where people are asked how much they value it. So this is oxygen production, fishery protection, storm surge protection, water quality cleaning, things which can be measured as actual physical services. So $64.5 billion per year are provided by the mangroves of the CHNEP area. Next slide, please. Seagrass beds, 11.9 billion. Next slide, please. Salt marshes are 186.28 million. The reason that's lower is because so many of the salt marshes have already been destroyed. They've been built on, that used to be that the jurisdiction line for upland development went past and included the salt marshes and stopped at the back landward end of mangroves. So a lot of Western Cape Coral, Western development, Punta Gorda Isles, other places are built on former salt marsh. But still, they provide a lot of valuable ecosystem services, and they're critical for many migratory birds that come through them each year. Next slide, please. So we know that we get a lot of hurricanes. This is the map of hurricane paths through the peninsula of Florida, and it's a little out of date. This one was, I think, from about 2012. But we know that each time we lose a hectare of wetlands, whether they be mangroves or salt marsh, there's a $33,000 increase in storm damage from a specific storm. That's $44,166 in 2023 dollars. So the current annual storm protection value of our coastal wetlands in CHNEP is $11,028 per hectare per year. And for those who don't know your hectares, it's about 2.14 acres. So overall, it's been estimated in the U.S. coastal wetlands have provided 31.05 billion per year in storm protection services. And you can see, and I worked on this too for the Regional Planning Council post hurricane impacts. Wherever you had a wide wetland buffer, those communities did not get hit, did not lose buildings, did not lose lives the way those communities that did not have them along their shoreline. And every time somebody wants to remove their mangroves or hedge their mangroves low, they're asking for future storm damage. Next slide, please. So far, I've worked on 57 major and 36 somewhat smaller land conservation projects from Hernando County down to Monroe and inland to the middle of the state. So my life total right now, by the way, I'm still working on some, is about 691,458.84 acres. And it's not just though the acreage, but how they connect that's important. And we need to just keep up on this. Every once in a while, not sometimes from certain people in certain political party, they keep asking me, when is it enough? Well, we haven't gotten there yet. but we do need to continue to look for land acquisition in the right places at the right time with the right tools, with the right partners. Next slide, please. So here's my take-home message and my message that went to the college students. These are the things I've learned over the years. You have to have a persistence of vision. Conservation takes time. It's not a one and done in a year process. You have to use science first. Don't abandon the science. I won't get into details why sometimes this happens with people who want conservation land put aside. I'll say one of the worst things we often run into is people claiming something is on a conservation property which isn't there. It takes a variety of tools to achieve success. It's not always fee simple. It's not always conservation easement. It's not always land swaps. One of the things we actually succeeded at one time was a land swap where instead of wanting money or wanting an easement money, they wanted land owned by the federal government in a downtown in another state. And so the Big Cypress National Preserve got huge amount of acres of land preserved in return for basically a corner of a downtown area in Phoenix, Arizona, because that was considered of equivalent value. Public participation always makes a better plan and engenders support. You can't get a big land acquisition or even some small ones done unless the public that's there, that uses that land already, that surrounds that land, wants it to be preserved. If people don't want it, it's very likely they're going to come out against it, and it's going to be very hard to preserve. Land acquisition is the best tool for long-term protection. Regulation will not work in the long term. Governments change, laws change, lawyers show up, and things that are supposed to be regulatorily protected end up not being. Land acquisition and stewardship is a team effort. You need to have the stewards working with you as you do the acquisition to understand what the stewardship needs are going to be. But they also need to understand the acquisition has to come first and that they don't drive the process. Regulations change and not always for the better in this century. Unless land is acquired, it'll be necessary to fight the same battles over and over again. And even then, some people have bad ideas what to do with public lands. I spent a lot of my time in my working career trying to keep people from running roads, power lines, high-speed rail, you name it, through preserves we already had. Had good success at keeping them out, but who's to say? Maybe if somebody's less persistent in their vision, you may end up with an interstate through a lot of the areas that we work to preserve as wildlife corridors. So don't delay land acquisition just because management funds are not currently available. And that's how we lost some really great coastal oak scrubs in Lee County. That we could have bought the land. Those preserves would be there today with scrub jays on them. But people were saying, well, we don't have the management funds for that. And so it was abandoned. And now there's high rises and those preserves are gone. Those scrubs are gone. So those are my take home, that we need to continue to be doing this. We need to do it together. And it's not just a legacy, it's an enjoyment for us all today. Next slide. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, while Debbie's coming on, I just want to say thank you, Jim. I very much appreciate these words of wisdom and getting this, perspective, both historical up to present, of the continuum of work that you and so many others have done through the years to get us to where we are, and it helps inspire us as to, you know, how we can do the next leg of this journey and trying to get the Florida Wildlife Corridor and other key land acquisitions like this South Florida National Refuge concept, how we can get those furthered as well.
Thank you, Jim. And it underscores partnerships and cooperation and collaboration between all segments of the community, from the politicians to the citizen. And again, that's one of the strengths of the NEP. That's what we are. That's what we do. And the more we do collaboration and cooperation, the more successful we can be. Again, thank you for everything you've done throughout the decades, Jim. We all know and have benefited from your work. We're a bit behind on the agenda. So are there any other comments? I see Nicole has one.
Just quickly, Jim, thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating. And one of my frustrations is that, you know, we have so many new people coming here, and they really don't understand that our landscape is what it is, somewhat by design, with the land acquisitions, with areas set aside because of lawsuit settlements. And Collier County is turning 100 this year. And I think one of my frustrations is that the media and journalists want to kind of talk about what's happening in the RLSA, which is important, but they're really not reflecting back on Southern Golden Gate Estates, Deltona settlement, you know, those sorts of things. So presentations like this, I think, are really important because it hopefully makes people stop and think about all of the effort that went into the landscape that we're living in today. So really appreciate this.
Perhaps it would be good if we could do one that was specific for Collier County, showing that long history that goes from the protection of Rookery Bay through and the Deltona settlements, all the things that had to be done to get what was preserved, including the story of the Big Cypress Preserve.
I think that would be great, and love to chat with you further about that, because as Collier County's turning 100, the Conservancy will be celebrating our 60th anniversary. So we're doing a lot of self-reflection organizationally. So folks like you and Dave Addison and those that have been in the trenches for so long, I think it would be great to have that conversation.